I'm going to talk about hegemonic masculinity and sexual violence. And then I'm going to make some connections to violence towards LGBT people and trans policies, the preliminary data we have. So first of all, I'm going to start by talking about what is hegemonic masculinity. As conceptualized, first introduced by Connell. Hegemonic masculinity has been argued to be a cultural ideology that represents the idealized form of masculinity in any given culture. So it's not the same across the world. In one culture it might be one thing, in another, but every culture presumably has this elevated, idealized form of masculinity that is elevated above other forms of masculinity and femininities. And now within any given culture, Connell originally argued that most men seek to embody. They strive hard to embody the cultural ideals, but because they're such lofty ideals, it's rather hard to do. So most people strive for it, but very few men actually embody the cultural ideal at any given time. Importantly, these three things have kind of been picked up by psychology, and psychology has studied how men internalize it. But importantly, the conceptualization of hegemonic masculinity is richer and bigger than that. Connell also pointed out that the idealized form of masculinity is defined by powerful and dominant groups, of course, because people who have power and are dominant in any society get to define most of what's valued. And because of this, it's also embedded, masculinity is embedded in most political and social institutions. Across cultures, idealized forms of masculinity tend to be linked to power and status. So it links men and masculinity to power, status, and success, but not women and femininity. So the gender binary, there's very few cultures where you can find, well, I haven't found one. If you find one, tell me. But in most cultures, the gender binary is at the foundation of this. And importantly, as a cultural ideology, it's not just men that strive to internalize this and be good men. Most people in a given society endorse hegemonic masculinity or the idea that good men should be like this, whatever it is. And this represents a very status quo reinforcing process whereby dominant group members define what is hegemonic masculinity, subordinate group members endorse it, and it has a status quo reinforcing nature in much the same way that other cultural ideologies do, like principles of meritocracy in the United States. In the context of my own work, I study hegemonic masculinity in two ways implied by this conceptualization. The first is consistent with how most psychologists have studied it as a masculine identity that men strive to internalize. In the United States, hegemonic masculinity prescribes that men should be high in power, high in status, tough, physically, emotionally, mentally tough, which are attributes that make it more likely that you'll be high in power and status. But different from most conceptualizations of social identity, it also has an anti-femininity prescription, that the gender binary at the foundation, that good men are nothing like women. This gets talked about by gender scholars as the anti-femininity component. Also, people have done research studying men and boys across time, ethnographic research showing that it comes out and is sometimes referred to as the specter of the fag. And it's socialized through what's called fag discourse. And to be very clear, it's not about gayness. You can be a good man and gay, but you cannot, the fag language, and I apologize for the use of this language, but as a queer person, I use the language that we're targeted with all the time, and I know it's uncomfortable, but yep, it's uncomfortable. But part of what it does is it's the feminine, not masculine embodiment. So you can be gay and good and big and strong and fine, but if you lack these masculinities, then you move into the specter of the fag. Okay, so those are the components. Now, because my colleagues have studied masculinity as very precarious and easily threatened, and they've argued since these different components that one of the things that happens when masculinity is threatened is that acts of dominance and aggression prevail, because if people get physical or aggression right away, it rapidly reestablishes one as powerful and dominant. Those studies have mostly focused on, non-intergroup context. I've extended the work to look at what are the consequences for masculinity threat for relations with women, for relations, for LGBT attitudes, and then we'll talk about some other work and other groups that are targeted as well. I also do research that looks at hegemonic masculinity as a cultural ideology that everybody endorses. So I look at the degree to which men and women, non-binary people endorse these ideas of this is what a good man is, and what does that predict? If masculinity is in fact embedded in social and political institutions, then it should predict a whole bunch of things. And I argue that in order to study some phenomenon that we're interested in, particularly those that have immoral connotations and persist over time, like sexual violence and all these sorts of isms, that you really need to understand both. You can't understand it by looking at one or the other. I'm going to start my talk today to show you some work that I've done threatening masculinity and what are the consequences for sexual violence. Then I'm going to turn around and talk about some of the cultural ideology stuff that complements that. And then I'll tell you about some of the LGBT violence stuff that I've done and where that's at. I'll just mention it quickly because apparently I don't have like an hour and a half. But so masculinity threats. Given the conceptualization of masculinity, theoretically you can threaten masculinity in any number of ways, making people low power. But because men are not supposed to be anything like women, being like a woman in any flippin' way is a source of threatening. So I've been able to threaten masculinity relatively easily, as have my colleagues across the field, by leading men to believe that they're like women in attitude, skills, personality. In masculine domains, I've been able to threaten masculinity by having well-performing women perform next to men. And that's a threat if it's a stereotypically masculine domain. In those contexts, I've shown that threats to masculinity have led to a lot of different outcomes. But first of all, let's talk about the emotions. So the original psychological folks, the psychologists that studied precarious manhood, pointed out that men should become anxious when they're not good men. There's not a lot of data consistent with this. Sometimes you get some word completions that show anxiety, but anxiety is like not a good manly emotion to begin with. So that finding's not there. Recently, as we tried to identify in a publication that came out a couple years ago, we threatened masculinity, and we noted these that I want to point out to you that I think are particularly relevant to moral psychologists. Men who are like women in gender knowledge experience more guilt and shame, consistent with the notion that it's part of your self-concept, but also less empathy. You see drops in empathy. The reason we were looking at empathy is because if you're not supposed to be anything like women, it should be, some of my research is looking at the degree to which you selectively choose not to empathize as a way to maintain and avoid these emotions that would render masculinity precarious. And the emotions that I've found over and over again that I'm going to talk about today, these are more recent and we haven't looked at what they lead to. These public discomfort is concern about how I look in the eyes of others, and then anger, the degree to which that leads to anger. I look at public discomfort because I conceptualize the socialization of masculinity. When I originally started doing the research, it doesn't matter if you're a good guy or a kind of a guy I would say like I would want my daughter to avoid. It doesn't matter if you're one of those two guys. If I put you up and, both kinds of men experience public discomfort at being outperformed by a woman or being like a woman, which makes perfect sense if you think of the socialization of masculinity and how boys are tortured and punished for not being good men. So I would consider that kind of this implicit awareness of how do I look in the eyes of others, and that link was relatively big. Then the link between whether or not public discomfort leads to anger was more tenuous. Some people got angry, some didn't, and the ones that got angry are the ones that are a problem for us. So and my colleagues have suggested that it's linked to aggression. The model that I find support for over and over again, and we're going to talk about today, is that masculinity threats operationalized in my research as being like a woman. Performance, attitude, personality, roles, leads to public discomfort or concern about how you look in the eyes of others, which predicts anger, and that leads to compensatory acts of dominance or aggression that functionally should reestablish one as a good man. What my lab is interested in and how this is dominance over other people and at the heart of some of the problems we face. We've shown that compensatory kind of dominance can lead to a whole bunch of attitudes, sexist and homophobic attitudes. I'm going to focus on things more relevant to sexual violence today. So This is the wrong year. I don't know why that says 2015. I'm getting old. It's a 2023 publication, I'm sorry. But that's going to be on every slide because I think I copied this slide, but it's 2023 PSPB. So what we did, we had in the first study, this is a series of 3 studies. I'm going to talk about the first and the third. The second shows the same pattern, and we can talk about that in a minute. I had men and women come into the lab. These are Penn State students, and they took what's called a gender knowledge test. We did it nice and easy. They come into the lab, totally face valid test. You know, who's the designer of this? What kind of car is this? Totally face valid. What is a, I think it's called, what is a dime? What is a dime play? Is it a dime or a nickel in football? Like it's a defensive play and you have to identify what these, so it's just totally face valid, nothing else, from Lori Rudman's research. Then after scoring, we provide participants with false feedback. And they're told that here's what the feedback looks like. Their score is represented on the top here. And the average male and female is underneath. In the no threat conditions, men look that they're very similar to the average man. In the threat conditions, they're much further over here like the average woman. Sometimes we label these gender identity. We didn't realize the difference. Sometimes the endpoints are labeled gender identity, feminine or masculine. Other times it's feminine or masculine knowledge. And that makes a difference that I'm not going to talk about here today, but I'll tell you. It doesn't affect any of the findings I'm going to tell you, but it affects whether or not women experience a threat. Women never show aggression, but if you tell women they have a masculine identity, they experience threat. If you tell them they're good at masculine knowledge, no threat whatsoever. Okay, no anxiety, because masculinity is valued in most of the domains, and so that's the only difference. But women never show aggression that I'm showing. And what we found in study 1, we looked at different outcomes. The first one we looked at is self-reported likelihood to engage in sexual harassment. And we provided them with the standard scale, God, the 2015 standard scale, where they look at 6 scenarios where there's a power difference and there's an option of 6 different ways people can respond. We counted up the number of times across these 6 scenarios that men picked quid pro quo sexual harassment and said they themselves were likely to engage in quid pro quo sexual harassment. So that's the dependent variable. And what we found consistent with predictions is the pattern of moderated mediation. Okay, so whether or not you got feedback that you were like a man or like a woman predicted public discomfort, predicted anger, and then anger led to likelihood of sexual harassment. But this was true for men, not women. Okay, so this pattern only holds for men, consistent with predictions. In the second study, we looked at other things that aren't directly related to sexual violence, and we found that threats to masculinity led same pattern of moderated mediation, led to increased endorsement of sexual objectification and reports that you objectify the opposite sex, and increased reports of sexual narcissism, which is the belief that other people are there to be used as tools for your sexual pleasure. So those both peaked in study 2. We found the same gender differences in study 1, where we used the gender identity. Women felt more discomfort when and they felt angrier. We see this path, but not leading. In the next study, we changed the endpoints on the feedback, so it just said gender knowledge. Then women don't even feel uncomfortable, and it's just a male pattern. In the third study, because men do it, women don't, we just looked at men, and we looked at endorsement of rape myths. And we see that getting feedback that you're not a good man, you're like women, predicts public discomfort. Public discomfort predicts anger, and among men who feel angry, not all men, but the ones that feel angry, show increased endorsement in rape myths. There are 7 subscales on a rape myth scale. These are beliefs like it's not rape if force isn't used, it's not rape if she doesn't fight back, it's not rape if she doesn't, if there's not a weapon, if she dresses inappropriately, if she knows them, all the myths. Okay, so, and rape myths are highly correlated with acceptance of sexual violence and participation in it in the real world. So this is a relatively disturbing kind of pattern that we find across these studies that just came out. Now, even though this is relatively disturbing, it cannot account for the epidemic of sexual violence. So even if we wanted to, let's build a false, here we can say straw man and have it be appropriate. Let's just build a straw man And let's say 1 in 4 white women are, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 white women are victims of rape or attempted rape. Let's hypothetically say every single one of those is a different man. It would still only be 25% of men doing this, right? So it wouldn't really, and we have these really high rates that persist over time. 40 to 60% of black girls by the age of 18 have had unwanted sexual contact with people. It cannot account for those massive numbers. So in order to understand how pervasive and these big kind of patterns, I argue that we have to look at men and women's endorsement of masculinity and how it leads to acceptance of and support of sexual violence in men. And we did this during the Kavanaugh trials, the Kavanaugh hearings. And so as it was approaching, we started collecting data. MTurk, Penn State, 3 studies across the Kavanaugh trials. The data was collected during the confirmation hearings before and 1 study after. Study 1 and study 2 used Amazon Turk workers, 301, 305, roughly equal numbers of men and women. And then the 3rd study is Penn State undergraduates, equal numbers of men and women. Across the studies, we measured a variety of things in common. Hegemonic masculinity, we measured using male role norms that has the components. There's different models of masculinity that argue different things. But if you compare across all the different models of masculinity, 3 components always pop. That good men are high in power, high in status, tough, and nothing like women. Some argue more things, like being heterosexual, being sexually, potent, or however you would call it. They have different models, but those 3 are common across all 3. So we used the scale that has been argued to be the best measure of that, Thompson and Plex. We looked at evaluations of Kavanaugh and the women accusing him. This was on 10 items that measure things: trustworthy, honest, competent, respectable, and a variety of others. They all hung together well. We looked at demographics, political party affiliation, education, gender, and race, the same ones that we used when we tracked hegemonic masculinity predicting Trump support from 2016 to 2020, because these are the kinds of things that were argued to lead to that support in the populist view. Then we measured sexist attitudes across the 3 different studies. Across the 3 different studies, we looked at different sexist attitudes. In study 1, we looked at benevolent and hostile sexism. Benevolent sexism being the idea that good women should be put on a pedestal and protected, and bad women, hostile sexism being the idea that bad women should be punished. We looked at rape myths in study 2 and likelihood to sexually harass in study 3. And across all the studies, we did a hierarchical regression. In step 1, we looked into political party. Step 2, the demographics, gender, race, and education. Did that add to variance? Sexism, whichever one for the study, was entered in step 4, and in step 3 and step 4, hegemonic masculinity. We also included a 5th step, was hegemonic masculinity, moderated by anything, all the relevant 2-way interactions. And what we found, not surprisingly, political party, biggest predictor, strongest predictor across everything, of course, right? So those who are Republican supported Kavanaugh more than those who are Democratic. In step 2, the demographics didn't really add much above that. In the 3rd study, it did for some reason, not the first 2, not really consistent, but political party continues to be a robust and is the biggest predictor in every step. Step 3, we add sexism, and we see it accounts for variance in all 3 studies except study 3. Likelihood to sexually harass, self-reported likelihood to sexually harass did not predict support for Kavanaugh, but hostile and benevolent sexism and rape myths did. Most importantly, when we go this 4th step, we see that hegemonic masculinity in all 3 studies consistently added unique variance over and above, controlling for political party, gender, education, race, and sexism. And when we put it in, you can see on the bottom line, once we enter hegemonic masculinity, we see the sexism drop a bit, become not significant or not as big of a predictor in some instances. And in step 5, this wasn't qualified by anything. So hegemonic masculinity leads to this unique variance. And it holds, across political party. So summary and some considerations, and let's talk about stuff for a minute. We found that hegemonic masculinity does work as an internalized identity. It is easily threatened, and it does lead to violence, or proxies or good predictors of sexual violence. Here we found that it leads to sexual violence. In another set of studies that we published in 2022, Skemmerhorn and Vescio, we looked at threats to masculinity predicting anti-gay violence. And in the first 3 studies, we looked at all sorts of attitudes about gay people and sexism, denial of discrimination, and we replicated all the stuff we found. In the third study, we compared a US population and a UK population because we're similar cultures. The primary difference being in the United States, it's legal to use the gay panic defense. So if somebody hits on you and you aggress against them, it's legal to argue that they were hitting on you and you panicked and you killed them or you hurt them. It was first used in Matthew Shepard, and it's never gotten anybody off, but it has resulted in the mitigation of length of time serving. Until recently, a couple years ago, there was an SEC athlete who used the gay panic to defend against killing a trans person and did get off. So it's legal here, and it's completely illegal in the United Kingdom. Banned. You can't use that defense. What we found was the same pattern. Masculinity threat led to public discomfort to anger. And then it predicted, they call it lower, I forget what it's called. But I wouldn't call it violence, I would call it blatant discrimination. It predicts blatant discrimination. It also predicts minor violence, bullying, pushing, hitting. And then there's the third. All 3 of them are significant in both samples on both sides of the pond. So masculinity threat predicts. We also have data. Then when we go to the threatened masculinity cannot account for the problem. Like, threatened masculinity cannot account for the problem with sexual violence. There's not enough men aggressing for that to be true, so we have to look at the cultural side too, and the enabling of it. We find that hegemonic masculinity predicts the broader acceptance of sexual violence. And the data that we have, pilot data we collected in the spring, looking at the degree to which hegemonic masculinity predicted support for anti-trans policies. There's a whole bunch of them. 4 or 5 years ago, there were like 5 anti-trans policies on the books. Now there's 541. So it's just exploded as we try to control this threat to the gender binary. And what we found is that it predicted amazingly well, even stronger effects than here, but we ran out of time and didn't have enough subjects. This is the study we just got done rerunning, but I can't look at the data. So I'm assuming we replicate again, but I didn't want to show incomplete data. But what I think my data show, what I know my data show in terms of sexual violence is we get it predicting, men's acts of sexual violence and men and women's acceptance of those acts, or supporting of men who do it. We know that it predicts violence towards LGBT people, gay men. It was gay men in the first study, and we know it predicts support for anti-trans attitudes. So we get this kind of coming together. I want to think about what are the moral implications of the gender binary, and that being a good man has this gender binary built into it, that good men, who are the default people we think of, are X, Y, and Z, and the opposite of women. What are the moral implications of the fact that that is how masculinity is conceptualized? And one thing that we haven't talked about is that these notions of what is a good man are incredibly racialized. A good man is a white, dominant, and and Connell predicted not just that hegemonic masculinity reinforces dominance over women, but dominance over marginalized men. And so we have a paper under review right now showing threat to masculinity does, in fact, via the same path, lead to anti-Black attitudes, xenophobia, Islamophobia in the same way. So this kind of status quo reinforcing up the hierarchy. But the thing that's interestingly toxic, and I would say toxic masculinity is a product of hegemonic masculinity, but the thing that's particularly problematic is that most people in society endorse this and think that this is good. Good, powerful people have these attributes, and they're the attributes white, straight, dominant men have, and others groups don't. Women believe that, gay men believe that, straight men believe that, Black, white, Latina people believe that. So what's interesting is that in a culturally reifying and status quo producing way, it unifies white women and white men. in our racism down the hierarchy, black men, Latino men, and white men in their sexism. You know, it kind of, there's this kind of reinforcing way in which it blurs the isms, I think, in the name of what is a good man. Thank you. Yes.
Do you have plans to extend this to other countries? Because, you know, I work in Brazil, and you can get access nowadays to all kinds of countries, and be very interesting.
Yeah, we're collecting data. We're gonna start collecting data next semester in Turkey in the U.S. And so I'm kind of figuring out how do I make connections so we do all the cross-cultural work. But absolutely, yeah, Tia.
So it strikes me at the.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So anyway, fascinating talk. I loved it. So threats at the core, and it seems like, you know, that men are easily threatened here, and much of your work is focusing on men at a particular age, right? College-age men at Penn State in that sample, and then the online. But I noticed age wasn't control, and I'm thinking not just of age, but basically how concerned should we be, you know, as this extends, and it seems like there's this critical time point, especially college-age men, that may be particularly easily threatened. So is there any hope if men either are older, married, sort of more secure in their sexuality, and would those moderate some of these as a buffer?
Yeah, I think that there's reason to believe that if men kind of reject the gender binary and are secure, that we might see less of the threat and the violence that stems from threat. And I have a student who did a dissertation on gamers, who are men who, you know, embrace this nerdy identity. And the interesting findings are our dependent variables were what games did they choose to play, how violent, what are the avatars they made. And what was interesting, and this was during Gamergate, when women were producing games and getting harassed. And so we showed instances of harassment and who supports them. And the beautiful part and the most optimistic part is that gamers were not tolerant of sexual harassment, and they didn't do these hypergendered things. But there's a group of men that play games as many hours and choose to play a different kind of game and don't identify, and they play first-person shooters, and they made avatars that are butch and women uber sexualized, and they were totally accepting of sexual violence. So I think that the idea of embracing an alternate masculinity that isn't based on this gender binary, there's a big potential there. And I think that we see this in different, like I collect data in chemical engineering, and there's this nerdy and this kind of violent toughness isn't at the core. And so there's some places where we might find some embracing that doesn't have the gender binary that might be really helpful for us. I'll come over there, okay?
I hope I'm not getting too sidetracked, but for the manipulating scale that you used, you mentioned either identity or knowledge. And then you told us that when women are shown with manipulation that she has high masculine knowledge, you said she is not threatened, but my question is if she feels any positive attitudes after showing that a manipulation, and most importantly, are there any frequency in men who shows positive, for instance, like pride, when he is shown with...
Yeah. In the study we just published looking at emotions, we tried to find positive emotions. We looked at hubristic and authentic pride, and masculinity threat didn't. We thought it would affect one of them maybe, and there might be some positives, no effects on pride. So I haven't identified the threat leading to positive outcomes yet, but these are threat studies. So I don't know that we will there, but I do think masculinity, like in some of the work that our work is based on, some of the ethnographic work, groups of men who didn't do the stuff that our work is based on, boys with big Christian identities, black boys. There are groups of men that don't do this, so I really want to kind of pay attention to, as we deviate from, you know, what is hegemonic masculinity being threatened and what the consequences are.
Hi, thank you for that awesome talk. So one implication of this like masculinity as being not feminine is that as women, there are more ways that you can be a woman and it's acceptable. There are fewer ways that you can be a man and it's acceptable, and that comes out in the kind of conservative discourse, right? And I'm just curious. So, and then there's a feedback loop where then men are motivated to make the roles for women smaller so that there's more room for different ways to be a man. I'm curious if there's measurement of these things, like the zero-sum thinking about it and like how you think about those. Like,
yeah, absolutely. I think at the heart of this is the notion. Is the notion that the stereotypes, I think when men and women violate stereotypes, they both have tragic outcomes. But stereotypes for women are this wide because women went into the workforce, and stereotypes of men are like this. And there's data from Amanda Diekman and Alice Egley that were like early 2000s studying 50 years. From the 1950s through 2004, women's stereotypes just exploded, men stayed just like this. And we see, now more recently, we might be seeing some changing roles, but there's still data coming out pretty routinely about who's lifting the domestic burden, who's doing the childcare, who's doing these things, still showing a narrowness of male roles. So I think that, as we stretch that, but it's really, I think, the gender binary at the heart of it. So
to be zero sum, the binary, like.
Well, I don't know that, I think that a gender binary implies maybe some zero-sumness, but I don't know how much it's necessary. But I can tell you research that people who think in zero-sum terms are more sexist and do these things more. It's considered a form of subtle sexism to be zero-sum in your thinking.
Thank you. That was great. So the question, and you've touched on this a couple times in your responses to other people, but my question is, what are the most interesting ways that this set of that things are on the move in our culture right now? And are there any nascent trends which are the sort of things we could be encouraging to help fight back against this?
Yeah, I think that that's a really great question. So, kind of as I think through this, I do think that if we can I think there is a precarity, not necessarily to masculinity, but a precarity that predicts some problems. So like Taya's question asked about gender, we know there's 2 points at which gender is really highly threatened that leads young, in this transition period, and aging as people leave the workforce. There's some Swedish data, qualitative data showing that men become much more sexist at this point, transitioning out of the workforce and losing roles. But then, interestingly, there's a settling in that they documented and an attachment to family and a redefining that I would expect. So if we have some of this redefining of, what a parent is, what are these roles, but I really, really think at the heart of it is this men and women is opposite. So raising our kids, like I think people talk about gender in a way that they never would talk about race. And I can illustrate this to you by just read stuff and then put in black for women, white for men. And you would be horrified at how ridiculous it sounds. So we say stuff routinely to our children, to our partner in the workplace that we would never, ever, ever say on racialized grounds. And so I think some of that awareness of the essentialistic way in which we think about, and gender differences, when we talk about gender differences, there are very few gender differences that are that profound. There's more variability within groups than between, except for like on 4 different variables most researchers point out. And so I think that we really need to kind of go at this kind of binary essentialistic thinking point, even though there may be biological bases of some sort, but just this complete opposite. Done? Okay, sorry. Thank you.